Culture is getting darker. There's no escaping that. Most people have realized it. But can something like the comic book genre help not merely break through and escape the darkness that we see in our society today, but actually challenge it and in meaningful ways? Well, I have with me Detective J. Warner Wallace, who's talking about his new project today, and that's what we'll discuss on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Hi, everyone. I'm Lenny Esposito, and as I said in the intro, I have with me Detective J. Warner Wallace. Jim's been a great friend of the ministry, been on many times before, and every time he has something new in the works, I'm always anxious to hear about it. This next project, though, that you have is something that's actually a little bit different. While all of your prior books, Jim, have, first of all, been a solo effort, this one is actually co-authored with your son, who's also a detective, fourth generation police officer.
Yeah, third generation. He'll tell you he feels pressure, Lenny, that he has to have a boy that he can name Jim Wallace, who can do this one more time. But we'll see what happens.
I see. And he also went to school, studied apologetics and is a budding apologist in his own right. So why don't you tell me about this new project that you have coming out called Case Files? And it seems like it's something, again, a bit of a departure for you guys. How's that coming about?
Yeah, we've always wanted to do creative things. I think that's been the biggest draw for me when I was, my undergraduate work was all in design and architecture. And then I spent, 25 years really not able to exercise that creative aspect of my upbringing and who I was before I became a police officer. So now in this stage of life, I'm always trying to figure, well, how can I tell this in a way? We've got great apologetics books that have been out there for 2,000 years. They've been really solid Christian apologists. I mean, even in antiquity, we have some really good ones who are just covering the same ground, right? But so what we're trying to do is to say, well, what about culture that people are familiar with, especially homicide investigations or just any jury duty kind of case making? How can we leverage that in a way that's powerful, that tells the same truth in a way that people find more accessible? And of course, that evolves, right? Once you've written cold case Christianity, then you're going to try to kind of move the creative paradigm slightly so it's now creative and not repetitive. So when we started writing books like Person of Interest and Truth and True Crime, each one takes an evolutionary step, I hope, because I'm trying to be, that's the thing that is so fascinating for me. I didn't get a chance to scratch that itch for a lot of years, and I want to scratch it now. So it seemed like the next evolution of that was at some point be able to move into fiction that is in some ways teaches Christian worldview. But my son is the driving force of this because in our family, he grew up as the consummate comic book aficionado. This guy has got more comic books than anyone I know, and has always collected, and just his thing. And so when we got ready to think about what the next project might be, and he's contributed quite a bit to our website and on podcasts and other places. So Jimmy's already kind of, like you said, he got his degree at Colorado Christian University under the Lee Strobel program there, and so he's been wanting to do something like this. And as a comic book guy, well, we saw that our publisher, David C. Cook, had just purchased a comic book company. And that comic book company was in the sights of David C. Cook because that comic book company was doing comic book episodes of The Chosen TV show. And so they were doing these episodes, and that came under the attention of David C. Cook, the publisher. So they bought this company. And so I called him and said, hey, we've had ideas for these kinds of like detective stories. Would you consider doing a graphic novel? And so we got those artists together, and I don't have to draw it, so that's kind of nice. And we collaborated in a very open-handed way. And here's the whole idea. What you started off the show with is, I'm so glad you get it, Lenny, because not everyone does. But the idea here is that this is the reality is that we live in a dark world. And if you're a cop, you kind of know this, and you don't even really talk about it all that much. You go to work and you live it and you experience it. Then you go home and you try to protect your family from it. But if Christianity is true, it's going to have to survive in the world in which it really exists, not in this world we imagine, but in the world it really is. And with all the, the warts and pimples and blemishes that real people have, including police detectives. So we tried to write a book that reflects the nature of humans doing the work. And it tells, it tickles just one question in the Christian worldview, which is, how do we ground value, human value? And so this is often a question you have to ask in culture, because you know how many homicides are going to occur in America today? A bunch.
Yeah.
And not all of them are going to get reported. Probably none of them are going to get reported unless someone who's considered to be of value by the culture in some way ends up being a victim. And then suddenly that's going to make the news. Well, why don't the other ones make the news? Well, it's because we really struggle with this as humans. Like, how do we ground human value? What makes one life more valuable culturally than another? So we're just kind of tracing the activity of a serial killer in Los Angeles County who is increasingly targeting people that the culture thinks are more valuable. And we're doing it just as a way of examining the issue of grounding human value, a small aspect of Christian worldview. And that's something we did intentionally, Lenny. We thought, look, I was in God's Not Dead 2. And I remember a meeting with the screenwriters, Chuck and Carrie, a couple of years before the movie even filmed, and kind of helping them form out what the movie might even be and what my role in the movie might be, and even getting to write that scene. Here's what I see, if we're honest. It sometimes feels like the world around us, and even some Christians would say that Christian movies are like a cut below other productions.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, Christian art in some way is seen this way as well. Whether that's true or not, it's seen that way. And a lot of it's because we are really ambitious. So no Christian movie can be made without it having all kinds of overt gospel-oriented discussions or proclamations. I get that. And I can see why you'd want to do that. And also, it seems like because we are Christians who know that in the end, God's going to settle all accounts, we always want our stories, it seems, to land softly with somebody accepting the gospel. Like every issue in the movie is going to be resolved. Well, life isn't that way. And we knew that. And so, especially if you're a cop, so we wanted to write a story that is not overly ambitious. It's just going to talk about one issue. It probably will provoke some conversations if you give it to a non-believer. It's got one Christian character in it. We're not going to land this in a sweet way with everyone getting saved at the end of the comic book. It's going to land the way that real life lands. And so we hope to do something that feels well balanced, right, between what we hope the world could be and what we know the world is. And that's what we're trying to do in a story like this. And to be honest, it's 99% Jimmy. I was able to help him kind of chart where this could go and how we might be able to uncover these issues. But he's had so much fun shaping the conversations between characters. And all these characters in the book are characters that we kind of designed together that are people that we've worked with. We've just renamed them, so that when we talk about them, we know exactly what they're going to say. Because we worked with that guy for how many years? We know exactly how he's going to respond. And so we think there's a touch of realism in this graphic novel that maybe you wouldn't find if it was written by people who hadn't actually done the work.
Okay, well, there's a whole lot there. So let's see if we can unpack some of this stuff. First and foremost, so Jimmy's a comic book fan, deep comic book fan, which is interesting to me because of my background. I've done a lot of work in how the superhero genre reflects.
That's right.
It's
right.
Actually basically the core concepts are actually Christian. Yeah. And without Christianity, the superhero genre doesn't exist. That's another talk. But then, of course, comic books are the primary medium through which those were transmitted until the Marvel universe came out that really exploded it visually on screen. Now, there was the Dark Knight series and things like that, but there's always been a penchant for this. This is a different subset, though, of the comic, because there was always a true crime vein within the comic realm as well, True Detective and some of these, and then there's the whole horror macabre piece, which is always the third piece. And I think some of this is due to the fact that you can illustrate things with ink and pen that would, even in those days, maybe not pass muster if it was Hollywood makeup and on film, right? It would be a little bit more disjointed. It would be a little bit more, repulsive to some people.
Right. Sure.
So you can do that, but at the same time, there's people who think that the comic book medium or the graphic novel medium, and there seems to be a distinction nowadays, isn't necessarily as serious and shouldn't be taken as such. But that's not necessarily what I understand. What do you hear from the publishers and from the how are audiences receiving this subgenre, since you have The Chosen out now and things like that? How are audiences? Are they mostly male? Are they mostly young? What do you see as the primary audience, and how are they receiving the comic book or the graphic novel format?
Well, I think that, anime is a whole other section, right? So we can look at graphic arts and graphic storytelling in many different genres, and probably they're going to cut across different demographics in terms of who the fans are of these. Here's what we do know, that for as many people, maybe dominantly male, who might read comic book, kind of fantasy and superhero genre of comic books, the dominant audience for true crime is female. So it cuts in both directions. It's interesting. And there's been a lot of research on this as to why that would be the case, but it does feel like we can kind of do both. But here's what I would say. I think that the way we used to see graphic books and novels, comic books, is changing the more dependent we become on digital media. So the idea that we want to, like the whole rise of the YouTuber and the rise of, even when it's just conversations like ours today, where people want to see the conversation, see the expression, it's just interesting to me. So I think we could have written it as a novel, just as a novel. Lee Strobel wrote a novel several years ago, a detective mystery novel. And we could have done something like that. And number one, it wouldn't have leveraged Jimmy's interest. But more importantly for me, as my work is all visual. I'm trying to illustrate the ideas because I know we are now in it's almost like a leveler. So for example, whereas before my mom, who's now in her 80s, would have been very content to pick up her dial phone and talk to someone on the phone, now she's become highly visual in her use of a smartphone. And it's images and emojis and all the other visual elements of the phone that have now taken this 80-something-year-old, and she's behaving much like a 20-something-year-old. So if you look at generations in terms of like just the years between the genetic generations, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at generations is their behaviors. And I think the digital world is leveling the behavioral differences between generations, and we are becoming more and more visual. So we thought, for example, why is The Chosen so powerful? Because it didn't start off as a comic book, or as a novel, or as a series of short stories. It was visual from start to finish. And so then when it comes down to, how can we tell this episode in a way that people might read it? The natural inclination is, let's make a graphic novelette or a comic book, whatever you want to call it, for each episode. Well, that's because we recognize that we are becoming a visual. We want to see it. And you're right. There is something that, to use that second dimension of illustrations to show, for example, emotions, to show violence, to show action. You could write about it, but a lot of graphic novels have that movement in it, and so we're always thinking about that. What's great about Jimmy is I would never have been able to write it on my own. I can help him with the overarching story, make sure that it's accurate, make sure that it looks the way we want it to look visually. But because Jimmy's a reader of comic books, he would often think to himself, well, this series of panels in my mind for this part of the narrative needs something else. It needs this visual side. We got to put a flashback. We got to do something, because this conversation in and of itself might be fine if it was a novel, but as a graphic piece, it's not visual enough. And so he was constantly tweaking and making sure that it met his standard of what he's grown up with as a comic book kid. So I think it tries to do both of these things, but I think you're right. Like, who's this for? Here's what I would say. I think we are in a weird kind of a transitional world. We're just on the very edge of AI and how that's going to change all content creation. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that we are using live artists, people who are really flesh and bones, who are doing these drawings, people who are well established in the comic book world. So we're using the artists that are able to do the work. Who knows? In the future, will comic books still use human artists? I hope so. But I'm wondering, already. We've moved to doing thumbnails and other short kind of graphic pieces with AI. And it's dramatically improving day to day. I suspect there's going to be a time in which you can input enough data to kick a comic book out with AI with literally no cost. To the act, because this is not an inexpensive book to write, because it involves so many people. It involves Jimmy and I, but it also involves a stable of maybe 6 artists, 2 lead, and some colorists and letterers and all the other people that do comic books. So I wonder if we wanted to capture this moment in which real, quote unquote, real comic books done the way they've been done since the beginning are still being done. And use real people to tell what we hope is a real human story. And so I think we're on that kind of the verge of a big change. You probably see it too. I don't know about you, Lenny, but I often think, we write books, and I think the first content that's going to be consumed by AI is going to be the written word, because it's so easy to you see it already when you
fake,
when you search anything online, you can see that there are just paragraphs and pages can be written about anything from any angle. And if they know enough about you, they can say, well, write it from the perspective of somebody who was born over here, raised over here, his family structure is like this, he's married, this is here's his work experience, here are the people he knows, and suddenly they can write it as though they're me. And so in the end, I think we're going to have to take advantage of these opportunities we have to do the kinds of genre stuff that I think is going to happen, for example, in the comic book world. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point hand-drawn comics are going to be of incredible value because no one's going to do them anymore. So.
Yeah, it's very much that possibility, especially since the comic genre does trade in certain very standardized looks, standardized framing, that kind of thing. Right. So it is easy as long as you have like a wire model or what have you. You can have it manipulate that, and they're doing that in film already to some degree.
Yeah, what's also interesting about that, Lenny, is like think about it. Let's say we have this inked panel. It's black and white right now, and we're about to colorize it. That coloring process is really how much can you afford? That's the question, because the more time I put in this, I can make this one panel feel like it's photorealism if I wanted to. But it would take a lot longer than simply putting in just one tone per let's say, per space, let's call it, per item, right? But then we're going to shade it, and we're going to shade it more carefully. And suddenly it's going to go from having 24 color tones in it to having an infinite number of color tones. Well, a lot of us in real life, no one's going to pay for that. But AI could do it in a millisecond.
Right.
And so that's where I think that this
I think it was Beauty and the Beast when they started doing like the ballroom scene that they animated the central characters, but all of the backgrounds that had all those lavish different textures on it and things like that.
Absolutely. So that's where I wonder, that's why we wanted the opportunity as finite humans to contribute to this genre. Here's what we think. We hope that this is a book that I think is perfect for people who maybe are kind of Christian adjacent. They are interested in how to these issues because they'll get raised in every movie, they get raised in every TV show about law enforcement, but they don't know how to ground them because they don't hold a Christian worldview, or they don't hold a robust Christian worldview. And I'm hoping that this is the kind of book that starts you thinking about, like, okay, so but yeah, why do we care about this or that, and how do we ground this or that? And that's what we're trying to do in this book.
Okay, well, and there's again, and I want to explore that aspect of it quite a bit more because I think that's important. There's so much that you've said in that regard. Also, I do find the critique of Christian arts because it does seem to fall into the trap of always trying to preach to the choir and things like that. There was, a matter of fact, I think it was 2017, Martin Scorsese put out a film called Silence. I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I heard about it, though.
Phenomenal, great film, because it's Martin Scorsese. Okay, this man knows how to direct. And the gospel is replete in it. It's about 16th century missionaries from Portugal, Catholic priests who go to Japan because the missionary they sent prior to that, who was played by Liam Neeson, supposedly apostatized. So he's become an apostate, and they send it's Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver. I mean, these are not small names, right?
They're big, big actors,
and they go there to try and bring him back. And there's a lot of questions about what it means to be faithful, what it means to be faithful in the face of persecution, what happens when you deny or reject your teachers, but then want to repent. All kinds of issues that this film brings up, which are it would be a fascinating discussion, but it didn't go anywhere. And most Christians I talked to not only haven't seen it, but they've not even heard of it. And I'm going, here's a major Hollywood release directed by one of the top directors of our lifetime, starring 3 of the biggest stars that you can have, and still nobody's seen it. Why? Because it's not that standard Christian drama. And I think that, if you explore those issues, they actually ask some hard questions, and you have to really think about your faith a little bit more. So I think that's important, and I think doing this provokes those who are comfortable in their faith as much as it provokes those who are either seeking or not yet understanding Christianity.
Right.
So I am glad to hear this process coming out, and what you're focusing on, human value, as the value of man as man, right? A human being. What's his worth? Why is he specifically considered valuable as just a human entity, not based on his status or something that society thrusts upon him? So I think those are important questions. And then with a graphic novel format, of course, you can instead of having to explain motion or explain action, you can just illustrate it. So the word count goes down, right? It's mostly dialogue. There's a little bit of captioned narration, things of that nature, but it's mostly dialogue then. And the dialogue hopefully hits harder. And then I think the other benefit in that genre, in that format, is that it is quicker to read. And again, in a society where we have people who have attention spans that are rapidly diminishing, that can be a benefit. But the question then becomes, what do they follow this up with? So say you've put this novel in someone's hands, they've read it, they're intrigued, they want to understand more, learn more. Are there going to be written resources or things that they can then plumb this idea to get a little bit more concrete or a little bit more detail from, so that they can grow in their faith or understand the Christian faith better?
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important. And we see this as a gateway book, right? This is something that'll get you started thinking about some of these issues, but maybe you haven't landed them yet. So I always, this is the tricky part. Like, how do we follow up with it without? If you, for example, are somebody who is not a believer, and you maybe even like you might be interested in kind of a macabre kind of a sense of interest in murders and homicides and all of that, but you really have never considered the Christian worldview. Okay, well, how do we reach those folks simultaneously? How do we help people who aren't? They would say, I am a Christian, but I haven't thought deeply. I never even really thought about connecting those kinds of worldview kinds of dots to my faith. How do we also help them? So here's what we decided to do. First of all, for anyone who purchases the book, I hate selling books. I've never thought that's just not my thing. I love being creative and writing books. The hardest part, though, is then getting them in the hands of people. So what I've always thought, if I could give it to you for free, I would. I just would. But so what I try to do is provide all of the extra bells and whistles that might be of value to you. That's all going to be for free. So we hope then that the cost of the book doesn't seem prohibitive given how much you're going to get for it. So what we do with this book is we thought about this. On the back page of the book, so the book has been printed. We only have a couple of printed copies right now. This is the first.
Okay. It comes out in about 6 weeks.
Yes, this is the first printed copy. They sent it to me early. And on the back of the inside cover, we have a QR code. That QR code brings you to a digital, short, maybe 30-page case for the resurrection. So we want people who think, well, why would this one character in this book, who is the one character who's a Christian, why does he form that view? Why is he a Christian? So we're going to give you a QR code to that. But for anyone who purchases the book, we also have a very brief conversation guide. It's the kind of thing that if you said, hey, I gave this to my cousin who's not a Christian, and this is the kinds of questions it's going to raise. And how would you navigate those? What does the secular worldview say about that issue? What does a Christian worldview say about that issue? So we've got a conversation guide that comes with it. And more importantly, we've got a 30-session, 10.5-hour Casemakers course that anyone who purchases the book, we're just going to send you that. And it's self-guided. It's completely robust, both written form, so you take notes in the guide sheets, and it's visual, 10.5 hours of video. Over 30 topics, from truth all the way to the existence of God, reliability of Scripture, nature of Jesus, all of that stuff we try to plumb in that 30-session guide. And we hope that will help people take another step. So yeah, we get it. We know that any piece of Christian literature or movie making that leaves you with questions but doesn't seem to always answer robustly every question we're asking you to think about, it needs follow-up stuff. It needs, a way to, so what does the Christian worldview say about these other things? And that's what we want to be able to provide. Now, here's what I would say. For every one person who reads a book, especially a graphic novel, which can be so entertaining because it's all, if you look at it, it's just one page after. It's a comic book.
Yeah, it's very visual, very colorful.
Yeah, very visual. You may not be the kind of person who's like, yeah, I'd like to engage a 3-week study. But there are going to be people who do. And that's what you're writing for audiences of one, again and again and again and again. And so that's what we're trying to do with a book like this. But we do know, and I've been shocked so far, because we just started connecting with people about this book. To be honest, it's such a collaborative experience that I really wasn't sure it was going to come off get printed, because this is 2 years we've been working with this company, and lots of changes. Artists are, they do all kinds of things. Artists are interesting people. They're creatives. And so there was a couple of times where we thought, are we going to get this? Is this going to happen? So I haven't been trying to say much about it until finally it was printed. And I'm like, okay, now we can talk about it. But I'll tell you that in the opening couple of days of just talking about this book, I am shocked that there is such interest. Like, the people you might think would be interested in a Christian apologetics book are very different than the people who are interested in graphic novels. And so there's a whole audience that could be reached with Christian worldview if it doesn't feel like, oh, this is a Christian comic. So here's what I would say. I was thinking about this the other night. You know how you'll know that there are bands that are Christian bands? And then there are musicians and bands that are musicians and bands that happen to be Christian.
Right.
And it's just about, so for example, if you know in music, Ben Rector. I love Ben Rector, a pop musician, I love his stuff. He's a Christian. And if you bought his albums, you'd probably, if you're a Christian at least, you'd go, I bet you he's a Christian. Because just the way he writes and some of the things he says, you can say, I bet but he doesn't have an overt, he's not a worship leader. He's not writing Christian music. He's a musician who's a Christian. And there has to be both in our culture, because all of us are not going to be pastors. And if you're working as in a service industry where maybe you feel like you're limited even in terms of your workplace as to how much you can overtly preach the gospel, you can still work there as a Christian version of whatever that is you're working at. As if you're a detective, you can be a detective who's a Christian, and it will change the way you interact with people, change the way you investigate cases. It doesn't mean, though, that every time I encounter a suspect, I'm preaching the gospel. I may occasionally, but I'm not a Christian who's on a mission through detective work. I'm a detective who happens to be a Christian, and it changes the way I work. And I think that's what we're trying to do with a book like this. This is a book that we hope is legitimate on its own. That if you're somebody who loves graphic novels and loves comic books, you're going to open it and say, wow, that was a good graphic novel. That was a good comic book. And it happens to have been written by a Christian. And there are some things in there that cause me to think. That's what we're trying to do with this, because everything else we write, Lenny, both of us, you and I together, is overtly Christian, where we're making a case that this is true and this is good and this is useful and this is necessary, and it's very this is different. This is coming in the back way. And if by the way, if people looked at this and said it's kind of goofy, it's kind of doesn't that art's not, it's like a kind of like C, B, C kind of quality art, not really A quality art, then it's going to die before it starts. But we think that the people we've engaged in this, the artists that we've engaged in this, are really good. And we knew right away when we started getting the comps and started getting the profiles of the characters, we said, wow, we're kind of way in over our heads here, because these guys are really good. We need to be as competent as they are on whatever we contribute, because we knew we had good artists. One last thing. Even David C. Cook, the publisher, takes this approach. So this book is a graphic novel that happens to be written by Christians. But they also, I think their best-selling books by a large measure is the Action Bible, which if you've got kids, you've seen it. It's basic, and there's like so many spin-off things from the Action Bible, and that's an overt biblical storytelling through art, where this is art that happens to be told by Christians.
Right. So it seems to me that the story is focused around the concept of the Imago Dei, right?
Yes, that's
right. Where you're trying to draw a contrast between our secular society, who's become more and more inured to that concept as we become more and more secular. And you see it in the fact that people believe that others can be canceled, not even based on what they're saying today, but perhaps on their past history. If they dressed a certain way at a Halloween party 10 years ago and somebody discovered that on social media, or because you have this specific political viewpoint, you're somehow less legitimate as a human being, really. And that seems to be the focus of this book. So do you try to avoid the technical words, the Imago Dei, things like that, to ground this? Number one, it's a heady concept, kind of tough to do in a graphic novel. So I'm kind of curious to see how you accomplish that. Yeah. But then my second question is, this is part of the case files, is the way the book is spun. So I'm kind of wondering what other projects or what other aspects or threads of Christendom are you hoping to pull in the future?
Okay, a couple of things. Yeah, so I think you're right. I think one of the things I always see in Christian movies is that at some point, one of the characters is going to break out either in language which is probably more familiar to people in the church than it is to non-believers. So we always talk about Christianese, but not even so much that. I also will see in these kinds of movies or books where someone is going to break out and say something that it feels like, wow, like C.S. Lewis is now speaking through this character, and it's robust, it's theologically accurate, it's articulate. Well, look, to be honest, most of us don't have those kinds of conversations. It's not like we get to bump into theologians who have deeply thought about this and written, not everyone's going to speak like N.T. Wright. At some point, you're going to have to be able to take the gifts that God has given you and try to find a way to throw the ball so that your friends can catch it. And so what we did in this is we were very intentional. The people who are saying things about God or otherwise are cops who are working a case. And one of the main character in this book is not a Christian, but there's a side character in the book who's a sergeant who happens to be a Christian. But I know when that sergeant is going to be like other Christians I've met in this profession. When a time comes, he's going to say a few things from his Christian worldview, but he's not going to sound like a theologian or like a trained apologist. He's going to sound like somebody you work with. And that's the reality of it. That's just the reality. Can we get this complex topic across using common language that we typically hear? If this is a character who speaks, we know these guys, we just kind of reimagine them from people we work with. Well, none of these guys we've ever worked with is going to be able to articulate the problem of evil or articulate how do we ground our value in a holy. They're just going to say little things that are certainly true, but may not be as theologically robust, but they still make the point. And that's what we're trying to do here. We hope, number one, it's realistic. Number two, we hope it models for the reader the fact that you don't have to be C.S. Lewis or N.T. Wright to have an impact with truth. And you can speak it and just in common vernacular and actually be quite convincing or powerful. So that's number one. So this is definitely a book that feels like the people, if we often, when there was any change that was made by the artist, and sometimes, the letterer would say, let's say it like this. And we'd say maybe yes, or we'd say, well, no, to be honest, no cop would say it that way. So we had to correct some things, how do cops hold guns? How do cops use their hands? Like some things that were visual, we needed to correct. Some things about location, because every one of these locations is a real location in Los Angeles County. So we sent pictures. This is what this corner looks like. This is what these hotels look like. This is what Santa Monica Pier looks like. This is what Palos Verdes looks like. We had to send these kinds of images. So we think it's accurate in that regard. But more importantly, the language, I think, is the kind of thing you would expect to hear from cops. Now,
so before you go on, though, I do have a question, because there are certain tropes, like television specifically, but Hollywood in general has made the detective a certain kind of person that everybody expects to act within certain parameters, So did you have to trade on some of I mean, if it was pure realism, I think some people would be put off by it, but there have to be some cliches, right? Hollywood cliches that are in
well, and some of the cliches are not even cliches. They're just that people see things they observe and they end up in the movies because we actually do those kinds of things, but not always. But yes, we did have to resist and help the artist to resist even visual cliches. Like, because I'll just be honest with you. If you're working cold cases, you're going to have to kind of amp it up a little bit, because so much of your work is mental. It is, reading through the reports and going, oh, this is something that's been hiding in plain sight. It's not going to be out in the field digging through a crime scene. This crime occurred 30 years ago. There's no crime scene for me to dig through. So what we had to do here is find ways to make this visual but realistic. And that's a trick, because you're right. Because, if you've got a conversation in which this is the kind of real conversation that two detectives have when they're working a case, that does not make a good graphic novel, because you have to kind of cut through some of the mundane aspect of our work to make it visually. So I think we've done a good balance of that, but you're absolutely right. Sometimes what is the biggest lie in TV and movie presentations of investigations is not so much it's the timing of it. Everything is compressed so that we do this today and we get the result tomorrow, and then we're off to this, and then this happens, and it looks like, wow, what an exciting job. Well, it's really, for every 10 hours you work in this job, it's going to be 9.5 hours of pretty much boredom. Just doing the mundane. Even if you're working patrol, it's going to be 8 hours of boredom punctuated by several minutes of sheer terror. That's the nature of the job. And so most of what you see, I remember, what was the, oh gosh, now you're going to test my old man skills. There was a cop drama that was done, a patrol cop drama that was done several years ago. Give me a second to think of it.
Adam 12 was the first one.
It was actually a movie, very kind of R-rated, gritty, definitely an R-rated movie. And they used, the writers took ride-alongs with police officers in two different jurisdictions. And they got a chance to sit and listen to the conversations between cops. Now, the action in the movie was still ridiculous. You might go your entire career and never see what these guys are apparently seeing in 2 weeks. But the conversations in the car were absolutely hilarious and spot on. Like, all of us, we asked ourselves, we had to research it. Like, how do they know? Yeah, they did ride-alongs. They heard our conversations. So I felt like, wow, that was really good. But a lot of patrol work would not make for a great graphic novel. You're going to have to condense that stuff out and get to the action points in a case. And in any case, there are action points. But like, I remember the first Dateline case I ever did, it took us about 2.5 years once we were moving to solve the case. From that was probably one of the fastest cases I've ever worked, 2.5 years. But to put it in a 1 hour show, you have to subtract out 2.5 years, minus 1 hour, because a lot of that stuff was really boring that we had to do. It was lab work. It was a lot of, back and forth with the DA and people at the crime lab, and who wants to see that? So I think in the end, yes, that's why these shows do kind of feel like they have some cliche. But if you read this book, I think my hope is that you'll become one of the characters on the team. This is about a homicide team led by a guy who's ready to retire, with a bunch of guys who are a lot younger, guys and gals who are younger. And that in itself, by the way, is fun to talk about, because we've been on those teams. And I've been the new guy on the team, and then I was the old guy eventually on the team. And there's always some tension on the team just based on the fact that the old guys are cranky and a little bit fed up with it all. And the new guys are overly eager and think that anything can be done. They still have hope. So I think that we try to illustrate some of that in this book also. Now, you mentioned the idea that this has got a 1 on the spine, because this is the first, at least of 2 books that we're going to do. The second book, we've already finished the script, and now we are starting to work with the artist to collaborate on, and it'll just investigate a different aspect of the Christian worldview. The second book will be looking at how do we ground moral truth? What makes something legal, illegal, moral, immoral? Are those the same thing? Are they 2 different things? So, and it also talks about like how the nature of the fallen nature of all of us. I think that since COVID and all of the riots that occurred at that time, there's a sense that people understand how broken cops are, and that we're nothing special. We're just humans like everybody else. And that means that you're going to see in our books, at least, the kind of real broken side of at least the main character in this book. We tried to kind of make come to life characters that we knew that were in some ways broken people. Like, they struggle with certain things, and yet they still are tasked with solving these cases, even though they themselves are a bit of a mess themselves. And so this is just the nature of it, and that again speaks to what makes them valuable. Like, as much of a mess as he is he still valuable in the eyes of who? Do his kids and his relationship with his daughter, does that make him valuable? Does his relationship with his team make him valuable? And if you put your value in these kinds of things, be prepared to have it stolen from you at some point, because people will treat you differently and have their own agendas. And we can't start evaluating ourselves and rating ourselves based on the people around us, because those people are going to change, number one, and those people are also fallen and broken people. And so that's why so we're trying to do it not only in terms of basically the outline of the story is that this is a series of serial killings in which the killer has decided to kill his victims in the order of how culture sees them ranked. So the first victim is somebody that probably would never get reported in the news. But At some point, he's going to target the most important people in the city. And how we go from 0 to 50, and what makes that last murder so important when the first one didn't seem like it was all that important, not even to the investigators. So I think so there's a realness in this, because let's face it, if you're a cop and you've been tasked with solving a case for somebody who hasn't even been on the chart for 20 years. Let's say they've been homeless for 20 years and they haven't even been, no one even know, they have no attached family. No one's asking you to solve the case. It's a case where no one's even called to say that they know this guy. That's your assigned homicide. The other one is, let's say, the governor of California. Well, most cops want the governor case. Why? Because it seems that case is the one that's going to get them some publicity, number one. And 2, they think that person has more value.
High pressure, though.
Yes, a lot more pressure. But the point is that's just the truth of all of us. This would be true for anybody. You say, oh, well, whose show would I rather go on? This show over here that has this many viewers, or this show that has that many viewers. I mean, this is about how do we assign value to things. And so that's why we wanted to talk about that a little bit in this book.
Okay, so as then a Christian who's going out and engaging in the culture in this way, do you find that this idea of human value has become central in our dialogue? Or is this basically one of the main areas? I had mentioned before that I think that we're seeing, as we become more secular, that we're, at least on the sidelines as Christians, we're noticing this slip. Are people themselves noticing it? Is the general public starting to say, what's different, or why is this wrong, or something like that? How do you incorporate that, or those ideas, and how are you hearing about it? And basically, why this specific issue did you choose to be the first issue that you tackled?
Yeah, I think it's happening. Well, I see it happening both in a slippery way that no one seems to notice and in a more overt way. So, for example, when we talk about, well, if humans really are not uniquely designed in the image of God, then we're just another species of animal that is no more important than any other species of animal. And at least here in California, what we're seeing, and I'm sure you're seeing it too, is that animals are given the same kind of deference that humans are. And this was never the case even 30 years ago. Like, you would never have seen someone walk onto a plane with his dog.
Yeah.
and sit
Or
right
in a
next to
grocery
you.
store or what
Yeah,
have
or in a
you.
grocery. Yeah, exactly. But now what we've said is that there's no distinction. Like this is a person and I'm a person. And if there's no way to decide or to distinguish between two different people in this sense, two different persons in this sense, well, so you see the elevation of animals. And every animal now has a right to go with you anywhere because these are persons too. And the culture doesn't even seem to be able to say, well, what separates us? Like, is there any difference at all? I mean, at some point, will it be murder to kill a dog? It's just interesting that I give you a small way. Like if you've got a cat, do you let your cat go outside? Because if you let your cat go outside, it might get eaten. Now, some of us would have said in the old days, well, if my cat gets eaten outside, it's a dog, kind of a dog eat dog world. I mean, the cat's also hunting
Right.
rats, so they could get eaten, or the cat could get eaten, but the cat lives outside. It's an animal. Well, what I see as a shift is no, actually, no, it's more like a person that needs to be protected, and it's almost like immoral for you to let that cat outside. You would not let your baby
That's
play
right.
in the street.
They're in social media circles or next door neighbor. Yeah, you see these people because we have, for example, we have a coyote issue around here.
So do we.
And it's that. How could you have let your cat out, or how could you have let your small dog out after dark? It was dog's got to go to the bathroom or leave himself too. It was just I was right out there, but the coyote came and grabbed it. But yeah, they react morally.
As if you let your child go outside, your toddler, what are they doing? They're saying basically these are the same thing. They're just two different kinds of person. Well, we've lost the ability to distinguish between one and the other. So that's happening in a subtle way. But I also think it's kind of at the root of all of the other issues. Look, I think we are becoming more secular, but we're not becoming any less religious.
Right.
And all we do is we take our religious impulses and we apply them to other things where we used to apply them to God. And Paul talks about this, that you see this all the time. He talks about it in a letter to Timothy, that we are not becoming less religious. We are simply forgetting where it is we should apply this kind of thinking. So in the end, yeah, I think that part of it is when every time you're talking about a worldview issue, you're really talking about a foundational issue. And the foundations, we stand on them. We take them for granted. No one cares about the foundation in their house until they see a crack in the wall. And then they say, oh, you know what? What's wrong with the foundation?
Yeah,
Well, I think
something
what
shifted.
happens here, I think, is that the culture started to see cracks in the wall. And that caused them to look at their philosophical foundations. And I think that's what's going to have to happen. Now, I do think that even if you said that, yeah, I see a specific issue. I wrote this book to address, I don't write, I write evergreens. So, and every time I try to say something that would give it away as to when it's written, my wife will usually say, get that out of there. Because 20 years from now, they're not going to be using that. That's not a social media platform they're probably going to be on. You're dating your book by putting that in there. Well, sometimes you're using research. And if you want to use the most current research, you're going to date your book. But I've tried not to write books that are addressing crises or issues that are happening right now in culture. For me, at least, I'm looking back and saying, okay, so what's the foundational issue that has resulted in this current crack in the wall? Let me just talk about the foundational issue. And then sometimes it might feel like, well, I don't see what the crack is that's so important. But it's the foundational issues that I'm more concerned with. And I also think that law enforcement stories about death and life, lend themselves to these larger issues about human value, or the problem of evil, or how we ground our laws. Because these are the things that we have to wrestle with all the time, and that victims' families ask us about all the time. One of the questions you're going to get all the time is, why does nobody care about my sister who was killed in 1979? I fielded that question from a sister. And when I came into the unit, I came into the unit probably around 1999. So 20 years had gone by. She had been writing to the governor, the chief, the mayor for about 15 years after her sister's murder was. And to be honest, she had gotten pretty much no response at all. So on the anniversary of the murder, I see a letter come in on our desk. And her basic question is, what is wrong with you people? This is my sister. Why don't you think she's important? And so these are the kinds of issues you're probably going to grapple with if you work cold cases, for sure. Is, well, what is she no longer valuable because she's forgotten? Is she no valuable? Was it that the initial detective for some reason thought that it wasn't as important as other things on his desk. And maybe those things on his desk weren't even murders. So we have to kind of ask ourselves that question, like, why is it important? Why does it matter when humans are maliciously murdered? Not just accidentally, hit by a car, but I mean, intentionally murdered. Why does that matter? And of course, we kind of reflexively say, well, of course it matters. But really, I think you're assuming without grounding. And that's what we're asking here. How do we ground that? Because I'll tell you right now, this is what's so interesting, Lenny. I know we're going to run out of time here. But for example, if you're in California and you murder a woman who's pregnant, that is considered a double homicide.
Yes.
In the same state where the woman herself can, at the same time that she is being shot, she could have elected to have an abortion. At that child at the exact same moment, that would not be murder, because we have a clause in our murder law in California that says that is a human being and that is a murder unless the mother says it isn't.
Yeah.
So now human value has been grounded in a personal opinion.
So we see this, and this tension, I think, is reflective in broader society, and we're starting to see it in other aspects. Take, for example, our language, even how we use expletives or curse words. And I tell people, it used to be the if you remember the Christmas story, right? What was the queen mother of all curse words? The F blank blank blank. Ralphie got his mouth washed out with soap. If you remember that whole scene, it was great.
Yeah, right.
That is no longer the queen mother of all curse words. The queen mother of all curse words now starts with an N. And it's so bad that even in Hollywood films where they will say the F word all over the place, they won't say the N word. And They will bleep it out and they will just allude to it. Now that's fascinating to me. And I start to say, well, what changed? Why is society different? What made that, who in the 1970s, you would see it on television programs. That word would appear everywhere. And it was considered a slur, but it wasn't considered, an epithet or a curse word.
Right.
And so here's what happened is it used to be, we understood human beings to be different, as you say, from, say, the animal kingdom. And when you reduce a person to merely acting on animal instincts, procreation, things like that, defecation, what have you, and you use those terms to describe people or things, then what you're doing is you're making a person debased because you're equating them with an animal instinct. But our culture is now highly sexualized, so we don't think it that way anymore. What is held as sacred is a person's identity, their self-understanding. Yep. And race is a part of one's self-understanding. It's fundamental to identity. So our cussing reflects the fact that we understand what's most sacred about individuals, but now it's race that you can no longer slur or slander. It's not action. And just seeing that fascinates me, because there are folks, it doesn't matter if you're on the left or the right? They will tell you how saying that word is wrong or stereotyping is wrong, or because it's all wrapped up in self-identity. But the problem here is, as you say, now you've got a tension point. Now you've got something that's incongruent. At one hand, you're saying identity is the most important part of what makes a person, what makes the person sacred. That's the sacred value. You can't speak against that. Their heritage, their background, their family. You can't discourage or demean that. But at the same time, you're starting to say things like, well, everybody can do whatever they want all the time, and it's simply not grounded in anything but your personal preferences, which, again, it's a broken system. It doesn't, there's no solid concept under which we're guiding this. So I think it's, this is kind of part of the point that I think is really fascinating.
No, absolutely. I'll tell you what's interesting about that. You just said it. Paul says, writing to Timothy, that in the end times, people will hold nothing sacred, nothing to be sacred. Of course, what he means, though, is they'll still hold things to be important, but he's looking at the word sacred as being connected to the divine, that nothing will be grounded
to God
in the divine. So now when we say, well, this is sacred to me, we've taken what ought to be connected to God, something sacred, and we've said, I am the person to whom this is directed. I now am the authority of what is sacred. And that's that, of course, when that happens, then you're going to ground human value based on what you prefer. And this is why we see so much division, not just about classes and ethnicity and race. It's otherism. I always talk about it as otherism, the idea that we are inclined to affirm those who are like us and reject those who aren't. And this happens for every group. And why are we doing that? Because we've decided that we are the source of what we define as sacred. We are the place where we get value. I get to decide if you have value based on my preferences, rather than does it ground in something that I can't really move. And if that's the case, by the way, we're far more likely, if we could all agree on that, and of course I know that's a big ask, but if you could all agree on what's sacred about humans, how we ground their value, I think we would treat them, at least we would treat them equally, right? Because we'd all agree, well, their value is grounded over here. I can't move that goalpost. That's where the goalpost is. And so that's where the thing we're looking at here is, and do cops do that? Well, I hope Christian cops do that. But I think actually cops do it based on the other issues like is this somebody who's going to bring attention to my work? Is this I love the hardest ones that nobody else could fix, the ones that nobody else can solve. Give me that one. Well, that's just pure arrogance. That's just me pridefully thinking I want to solve something that you couldn't. Okay. What is that about? By the way, that ignores then who the victim was. Does the victim matter? No, just as long as it's an impossible case to solve, that's the one I want. Really? So again, we're not doing the work as ambassadors for Christ. We're doing the work as promoters of Jim. And that's just the truth. And we have to really be able, and this is why as you get to be an old man, it's easier to see. When I was the age of these characters in this book, I didn't see it. I didn't see it even when I became a Christian at 35. And a lot of it is because life moves fast. And you're in that river and it's going fast and you're just letting it take you where it goes. You're not stuck getting off at the shore and saying, hey, wait a minute, do I want to get back in that river the way it's going? I think it takes an old man view. So what was nice about this book for us too, Lenny, is that I've got a 36-year-old version of me doing the very work on the very team that I was a part of when I was his age. I mean, his career path is it just happened to bring him to that exact same team. That's where I was when I became a Christian. And then I've got the old version of me that says, yeah, well, although I see why we work that way and why the industry kind of promotes the idea of working that way, I also know now after, you can't read your scripture a couple hours a day when you're in the middle of a career and taking care of your kids. But at this age, I get slap myself if I don't take the time. And that does change your perspective. You get more and more grounded in the scriptures. And then the question is, can I tell a story to you without being overtly grounded in the scripture? Can I bring it up in a way that you'll make you think, but you won't feel like you just got preached at? You won't dismiss it. You won't dismiss this book anyway, because you think, oh, this is a Christian. So we've tried to be very careful even about, of course, if you pursue the publisher, you're going to know that it's from a Christian publisher. If you pursue our names, you're going to know that we're Christians. But if somebody just gave you this graphic novel, I think it would help you to see the issues without being put off by the fact it's written by Christians.
Okay. So the crimes themselves, I'm assuming you're pulling them from some type of personal knowledge. There's not one specific individual that you're modeling all these things after.
No, and to be honest, I always tell people I never worked serial killers. I worked cold case killers. These are guys who did one murder 35 years ago. They haven't done a murder since. They're actually upstanding citizens in all the years since they did that one murder. That's what makes them so hard to catch. But serial killers are different. So what we did is, this is definitely not a case that Jimmy and I have ever worked. Yes, we always pull from attributes or little bits and pieces of cases we're familiar with. And certainly the people are all distinct, like people that we know by name. We just changed their name to protect them. But that helped us because we're just channeling that guy. And that's something that, I'll give you an example of this. I had I don't think I've ever told anybody this, but I had a dear friend who was the senior guy on our homicide team when I first came on the team, and his name was Jeff Allen Lancaster. and he passed away last month unexpectedly after a complication on a surgery. It was shocking. He's older than me, but not that much older, and he was kind of rough around the edges a little bit, but just a sweet guy inside. And he was off-putting at first. I mean, he's a big guy, ex-football player. He's a physical presence, and he was kind of gruff, but super smart, calm. You didn't want to get to the temper part. If there was a temper in there, you didn't want to see it. But that guy became, I just took his name. His name is Jeffrey Allen Lancaster, and I call him Alan Jeffries in a lot of my books and in a lot of my kids' books. He's the main detective character in the kids' books because it was just so easy to write a character that I could tell you how Jeff would say this. I knew him so well. You could predict what was going to come out of his mouth. And so now that he's passed, I feel like I'm not at the same place where I was before, where I didn't want to. Just a great man to me, just a great friend too, because he was the kind of guy who, as a new guy, he never belittled me. Yeah, he made fun of me, but in a way that he knew was going to make me better. So yeah, we tried to find the people in our career that we just started channeling those characters. And it's the good thing about Jimmy and I is we had a little bit of an overlap. So a lot of the guys that I worked with when I was first on the job were guys who worked with my dad. And I knew those guys really well. I had another 10 years. I worked with, as my partner for 10 years, a guy who did the first 15 years of his career with my dad. So he did the last 15 with me. So that was kind of neat. And Jimmy has the same thing. So a lot of the guys we're talking about are people we both worked with. I just worked with them at the beginning of their career, and he worked with them at the end of their career.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's another thread that makes it an interesting story and probably something that's also interesting to read. What else do we should you let our listeners know? What else about these books are different or unique, or that things that maybe we've not touched on?
Well, I just say this, like we always talk about, like, what are the things that will help you go forward? We've tried to create extra stuff. So right now in the pre-order, for example, if you go to our website at coldcasechristianity.com or just type in casefilesgraphicnovel.com, casefilesgraphicnovel.com, you'll see our landing page for the book. So right now, anyone who purchases this book in the pre-order period before April 1st, it gets a free digital download of Forensic Faith. That's a book we did on the nature of. So that's something that we hope will be attractive to people. You can also download the first chapter of the book right now, so you can take a look at it and see if it's for you or not. So that's also available on that landing page. And we also have on that landing page, we have an extended video that describes the kind of a conversation between Jimmy and I, so you can see what we're doing in the book. That's available for anyone who pre-orders. And also, Jimmy put together kind of a guide to Christian comics. And it has a bit of the history of Christian comics, some of the classic writers and producers of Christian comics, and that comic book guide. Those are only going to be available for the pre-order, and then on April 1st, all of that stuff goes away, and we have a different kind of an offer, because that offer is really about helping you become a better Christian case maker and preparing you to have the conversations you'll hopefully have with anyone you give this book to.
Okay, that's great. That's a lot. Now, it would strike me to be antithetical that there would be an audio version of this to come out. That doesn't seem to make.
We're working now
sense.
with, because do you know there's actually an audio version of the Action Bible that was completely, acted out with background noise and all this other stuff.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there is. And so that company is the company that I've recorded all of my audiobooks with. They're in Southern California. They're great. And now we're kind of like talking about, well, could we do an action version, like a because this is not the kind of book you can read. This has got multiple characters, and if I was to read it, it would be confusing. So we'd have to have actors who are willing to do that. And is that possible? Well, it's a bit of a big production, and you know how this works. The day is coming when we're going to be able to tell AI to do it.
Right.
So we're in this window, right? Of, hey, can we assemble a team right now? Is it going to be cost prohibitive? Could we assemble a team to do this? How many people? There are no versions that I'm aware of audio versions of graphic novels that aren't acted out as like kind of like a drama. So what would this be? That's what we're trying to figure out next.
Okay. Well, Jim, always great talking with you. I so appreciate the time. I'm excited to let this or see this book when it comes out. I will put the links below, course, and share it with all the audience members, and just look for great things. And then next time we'll have to get Jimmy on, and we'll have to definitely talk about superheroes, because I think
for sure.
that would be an interesting conversation.
No, that is, I'm going to tell him he needs to come and do that, because he would love to. But you'd be sorry you asked him, because he would love to talk about that.
Now,
but
does he make a distinction between being a Marvel guy and a DC guy?
I think he would say probably most of, I don't want to speak for him.
Okay.
He's got so much of both. I mean, the whole wall of the garage is completely categorized, alphabetized, systematized collection of comics in boxes, in storage boxes. So this guy's like, this is his thing, which is why I wanted to do this. But I wanted to tell people who are watching us too, one of the ways that you and I partner are on, like, you've run a number of conferences. So
getting ready to do one next month.
Exactly.
Actually.
And I just want people to know that those are of high value. So just look at Lenny's website, because you're going to see those are things that this year, I think I was already booked when we talked about this. Right. I really wanted to be part of it, but I've been part of your conferences before. So those are definitely worth attending for sure.
Well, I appreciate it so much, Jim. Thank you so much. And always great talking to you. And we'll see you soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks. Right. Appreciate you.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.